Ysabet Cenn was brought back from exile to watch the Dragon King declare a war from words she had never written. The Cinder Embassy had been cleared of every object associated with peace except the Ember Conch. It rested on a black stone pedestal beneath the treaty dome, large enough to cradle in two arms, its spiral shell dark as banked coal. Fine veins of orange fire moved beneath its surface whenever someone spoke near it. The court believed it preserved voices. Ysabet knew it preserved more than sound. It remembered lips, hands, breath, and the shape dragonfire took when an oath passed through it. Royal guards placed her beside the western doors, far from the treaty table where she had once served. Iron cuffs circled her wrists, connected by a short chain designed to prevent full signing. That detail hurt more than the exile cloak. They had not merely restrained her. They had restrained the language in which she could defend herself. Across the embassy, Dragon King Talren Arcos stood beneath the crimson war banners. Black scale armor covered his shoulders and chest. His dark hair was drawn away from a face the court knew as severe, controlled, and nearly impossible to read. Behind him, the high windows burned with the reflection of his vast bronze-black dragon waiting in the courtyard. Talren looked at Ysabet only once. The glance lasted less than a breath. It was still long enough for her to see the tension along the left side of his jaw, the side nearest the ear. He always turned away from loud ceremonial flames. Most people assumed the habit came from arrogance. Ysabet had noticed it during the treaty sessions. He heard less on that side. He had never told the court. Royal envoy Farron Day stepped before the conch wearing white diplomatic robes edged in ember gold. He carried the official treaty scroll Ysabet had supposedly corrupted. The Eastern Kingdom rejected peace, he announced. Its king demanded control of the Ashwater crossings, refused shared access to the Cinder Reach, and threatened armed dragonfire if our patrols remained. The nobles watched his mouth only when he raised his voice. Ysabet watched it when he lowered it. 6 weeks earlier, during the final negotiations, those had not been the terms. The Eastern King had agreed that neither crown would cross the Ashwater with armed flame. He had offered neutral passage through the Cinder Reach and requested 2 independent interpreters at every future meeting. Ysabet had recorded the agreement in treaty sign. Farron had delivered the spoken version afterward. Talren had believed him. Farron turned toward the throne dais. By the authority granted to this embassy, I asked the Dragon King to recognize the treaty as broken and authorize war. Talren's right hand rested on the black iron rail before him. Ysabet remembered that hand pressing the exile decree into the table. You failed to preserve the spoken meaning. That was what he had told her. Not that she had lied. Not that she had betrayed him. That she had failed to preserve what others said. As though understanding belonged only to sound. Talren raised one hand. The embassy doors locked. War braziers ignited around the chamber, and the gathered dragon lords lowered their heads. Ysabet pulled once against the short chain between her wrists. A guard tightened his grip on her shoulder. She did not resist him. Instead, she looked at the Ember Conch. Before the treaty ended, she had cut the true signed clauses into the shell's inner lip with a scribe's ember needle. Not because she expected treason, because signed language vanished too easily when only speaking men controlled the record. Talren began the declaration. By crown flame and dragon blood, the conch opened. Not physically. Its spiral filled with blue-white fire, and the entire embassy went silent beneath a pressure no ear was required to hear. A pair of luminous hands appeared above the pedestal. Ysabet's hands. They moved through the first treaty clause with exact, disciplined clarity. Neither crown shall cross the Ashwater carrying armed dragonfire. Farron stopped breathing. The projected hands continued. Neutral passage shall remain open to healers, civilian caravans, and unarmed witnesses. Talren's declaration died unfinished. What is this? One counselor asked. Ysabet could not hear the question, but she read it from his lips. Farron recovered first. A damaged recording. The exile's marks have contaminated the conch. Ysabet lifted her chained hands as far as the cuffs allowed. The conch remembers movement, she signed. It did not judge meaning. It preserved formation. Lips, hands, breath, and oath fire sequence. Few in the chamber understood her. Talren did. Not fully, but enough for his eyes to narrow. Farron faced him. Majesty, she is repeating the same mistranslation that caused this crisis. The Ember Conch flared again. This time, it projected a mouth beside Ysabet's luminous hands. Farron's mouth. The conch showed the final treaty session as fragments of motion rather than a complete memory. His lips formed one clause while Ysabet's hands recorded another. "Neither crown shall cross the Ashwater with armed flame," her hands declared. "The Eastern Crown yields the Ashwater crossings," Farron's mouth answered. Two versions. One moment. One deliberate change. The dragonfire surrounding Talren shifted from gold to white. Farron stepped toward the pedestal. The conch cannot distinguish translation from interpretation. Ysabet looked directly at the king. "Then remove my cuffs." Talren read the signs slowly. His gaze dropped to the shortened chain built to silence her hands. For the first time since her exile, he seemed to understand what the restraint admitted. Farron had not feared Ysabet's voice. He had feared that she could show what his voice had changed. Talren ordered the guards to release one wrist. The right cuff opened. Ysabet raised her freed hand and formed the clause Farron had erased from the official record. Both kingdoms require independent signed testimony before any act of war. The conch answered with a second projection. Another mouth appeared inside the fire. The Eastern Kings. He was not threatening Talren. He was asking for Ysabet to remain in the room. Then Farron stepped between them. The image ended before the court could see what happened next. But one ember mark remained inside the shell. The private envoy seal used to close the recording. Farron Dace. The war had not begun because Ysabet failed to hear. It had begun because Farron believed no one would watch his mouth. The Ember Conch had shown the lie, but Farron's seal still held the part of the treaty he had needed buried. The private envoy mark burned inside the shell like a closed eye. Farron stood between the pedestal and the court, his white robes bright against the dark embassy stone. "Envoys are permitted to close diplomatic records when continued preservation threatens crown security," he said. "The seal proves procedure, not misconduct." Ysabet watched his mouth. "Threatens crown security." He formed the phrase carefully, giving each word the weight of law. Talren looked toward her freed right hand. Ysabet raised it and signed slowly enough for him to follow. An oath record requires both treaty witnesses to close it. Farron answered before Talren could. "She has no standing to interpret embassy law. She was exiled for corrupting the same record now under dispute." Ysabet lifted her chained left wrist. The unfinished sign remained trapped between her hands. Talren's gaze settled on the cuff. "Release the other one." The guard hesitated. "Majesty," Farron said, "an exile may not give formal testimony inside a war chamber. I did not restore her office." "No. You are allowing her to perform it." Talren did not look away from Ysabet. "Release her." The second cuff opened. Ysabet rubbed the red line around her wrist only once. Then she stepped toward the Ember Conch. She did not touch it. The shell preserved formation, but meaning still required someone capable of reading how the fragments belonged together. Inside the orange veins, 4 traces remained beneath Farron's seal. A mouth closing around an unfinished clause. 2 hands interrupted halfway through a sign. A sharp inward breath. A line of oath fire extinguished before reaching the shell's center. Ysabet pointed to the first fragment. The Eastern King's lips had formed her name. Not a threat. Not a command. Ysabet Cenn remains. She signed the phrase. Talren understood only the first word. His eyes moved to her face. "Your name?" She nodded. Farron's expression remained composed. The Eastern King may have requested her presence because she favored his interpretation. Ysabet pointed to the suspended hand fragment. The Eastern interpreter's fingers had begun the sign for independent witness. The motion stopped when Farron's shoulder entered the preserved field. "He stepped between them," Talren said. Ysabet nodded again. Farron turned toward the council. "An envoy stands between crowns by definition. Position proves nothing." Ysabet watched the final breath trace. The Eastern King had inhaled sharply through his nose before the seal closed. His dragonfire rose pale blue at the edge of his mouth, then narrowed instead of expanding. Not battle flame. Correction flame. He had been preparing to challenge the spoken translation under oath. Ysabet signed the sequence. He heard the altered words. He requested independent testimony. Farron closed the record before the correction entered the oath fire. Talren followed only part of it. Ysabet repeated the signs more slowly. This time he did not pretend understanding. What did he request? Ysabet pointed to herself, then to the conch, then formed the two-handed sign for equal witness. Farron's lips tightened. The Eastern King had already accepted spoken protocol. Ysabet shook her head. She directed Talren toward the official treaty scroll. The final clause ended with an empty ember channel. Spoken terms had been entered above it, but the space reserved for signed confirmation remained unsealed. Talren placed 2 fingers against the parchment. "No signed witness mark," Farron said, "because the negotiations ended in dispute." "No," Ysabet signed. "Because you ended the record first." Talren read the movement from her hands. His face went still. The Eastern King had not threatened war. He had asked for the one witness Farron needed removed. The council murmured behind them. Some understood the implication, others watched Farron, waiting for his authority to explain it away. He did not disappoint them. Even if the signed clause remained incomplete, the Crown recognized the spoken record. War protocol permits action when a required witness is unavailable. Ysabet turned sharply toward him. Unavailable, not absent, legally absent. Talren heard the word too. Bring the war decree. A clerk carried the black scroll from the throne dais. The decree contained a conditional clause beneath the declaration of treaty failure. Independent signed testimony waived due to legal absence of appointed treaty scribe. Ysabet read the filing date. Her exile decree had been entered at dawn. The treaty record had not been officially closed until sunset. Talren looked from one document to the other. He had exiled the required witness before the agreement was complete. Talren had not only trusted the wrong voice, he had made the right hands absent. Then the court had used her absence to remove the safeguard that could have stopped the war. Farron had not merely changed the treaty. He had arranged the law so that Ysabet's removal made his version sufficient. Talren's hand tightened around the war decree. He had trusted the spoken record because sound was easier to control than witness. At the bottom of Ysabet's exile order, beneath the charge that she had failed to preserve meaning, appeared the filing authorization submitted before the treaty session ended. Royal Envoy Ferran Dace. The treaty had not failed before Ysabet was exiled. Ysabet had been exiled so the treaty could fail. Talren held the 2 filing times beneath the embassy lamps. Exile entered at dawn. Treaty closure entered at sunset. Between them lay an entire day in which Ysabet had still been the appointed signed witness, yet the court had already begun treating her absence as law. Farron stood beside the Ember Conch with his hands folded inside his white sleeves. Preliminary filings are permitted when interpreter corruption threatens crown security. Ysabet watched the measured movement of his mouth. Interpreter corruption. The phrase had been written before the Eastern King finished speaking. She signed toward Talren. An exile cannot take legal effect while the oath record remains open. Talren understood the signs for exile and oath. He looked toward the embassy magistrate. "Is that true?" The magistrate hesitated. "Under ordinary treaty law." "This was not an ordinary negotiation," Farron said. The Eastern Court had already displayed hostility. Ysabet turned to him. "Before or after you warned the War Council?" His eyes followed her hands but gave no sign that he understood. Talren did. "Only the question, not every word." "You sent a warning?" Farron's expression remained composed. "An envoy is required to prepare the crown for possible betrayal. Before the treaty closed? Preparation is not declaration." Ysabet lifted one finger. "Sequence." Then she pointed toward the embassy archive doors. The filing ledger, Talren ordered it opened. The chief clerk went pale. "War chamber records are sealed under crown ember." "Then use mine." The clerk carried a black iron ledger from the eastern wall. Its pages were thin sheets of heat-treated vellum bound with dragon bone hinges. Every filing left an ember sequence that could not be rearranged without burning the page. Talren opened to Ysabet's Nama. The entry appeared in 3 lines. Preliminary exile requested by Royal Envoy Farron Dace. Reason: suspected corruption of spoken treaty record. Status: required for war protocol clearance. Talren read the final line twice. Required. Farron inclined his head. A compromised scribe could not remain inside the chain of authorization. She had not been judged compromised. The envoy's office had sufficient cause. Ysabet signed sharply. Cause entered before evidence. Farron looked at her hands and then away, dismissing the language even while it accused him. Talren did not. He turned the page. The next filing, contained a sealed warning sent to the War Council before midday. Eastern Crown preparing hostile seizure of Ashwater crossings. Signed testimony unreliable. Immediate military readiness advised. Talren looked toward Ysabet. What was the Eastern King saying at midday? She did not return to the conch. She did not need to. Ysabet opened the treaty session schedule and placed her finger on the hour mark. At midday, the Eastern King had still been presenting neutral passage terms. His final sentence had not yet entered oathfire. Farron's warning had reached the War Council before the supposed threat existed. War had not entered through the Eastern King's mouth. It had entered through a filing time. Farron said, "Diplomacy requires judgment before certainty. If an envoy waits until every danger is proven, soldiers die. And if he declares danger before it exists?" Talren asked. "Then the crown is prepared." Ysabet watched Talren's left side remain angled away from the clerk's voice. The king could not hear every answer equally, yet he had built a system in which spoken certainty outweighed signed contradiction. She moved closer to the ledger. The war warning carried an attachment mark. Ashwater, Emergency Administration. Talren broke the seal. Before war had been authorized, the crossings had already been reassigned from neutral treaty control to a temporary wartime commission. The commission held authority over ember tolls, military shipping, mine transport, and dragonfire fuel entering the Cinder Reach. 3 houses were named. 2 belonged to border generals. The 3rd belonged to Farron's family. Dace Ember Shipping. Farron did not move. Talren looked at him. "Your house received the crossings before I declared war." Talren had not declared war yet, but his court had already learned how to spend it. "My family maintains the only fleet capable of supplying a rapid campaign. You prepared to profit from a campaign while peace was still being negotiated. I prepared to prevent supply collapse." Ysabet read the allocation lines. The toll share assigned to Dace Ember Shipping doubled if armed conflict lasted beyond 1 lunar quarter. It doubled again if the eastern mines were placed under occupation. Farron's family did not need the war to end quickly. They needed it to begin lawfully enough that no one could stop the contracts once soldiers crossed Ashwater. Talren turned the page. "Who approved the reassignment?" The clerk lowered his eyes. "The War Council required a royal patron's signature. I gave none. No, Majesty." Farron's calm finally narrowed. Ysabet saw it before Talren did. A tightening beneath the lower lip. A held breath. The same preparation he used when replacing another person's meaning with his own. The final vellum sheet opened beneath Talren's hand. Ashwater wartime rights reassigned upon anticipated treaty failure. Beneficiary commission accepted. Witness absence confirmed. Below Farron's submission stood the authorization of the most powerful military officer inside Talren's court, High War Chancellor Sareth Ilian, the man seated 2 steps beneath the throne. The man who had advised Talren to exile Ysabet before the final treaty session was complete. Farron had not created the war alone. Someone inside the crown had already decided peace was less valuable than the Rhodes War would open. Farron had changed the treaty's words. Sareth had prepared the roads those words would open. High War Chancellor Sareth Ilian rose from the seat 2 steps beneath Talren's throne. He wore no ceremonial robes. Dark bronze armor covered his chest and shoulders, marked by years of campaign heat. His hair had gone almost entirely silver, and one side of his face carried the smooth burn of old dragonfire. He descended without haste, not like a man accused, like a commander entering a discussion that had finally reached his territory. "I authorize the Ashwater Commission," he said. Several counselors turned toward him. Talren remained behind the black iron rail. "You approved wartime rights before war existed. I approved readiness before peace failed." The treaty record was still open, and Eastern intentions were uncertain. Ysabet watched Sareth's lips. He did not hide behind soft phrases as Farron did. He spoke as though necessity itself were a law older than consent. She signed toward Talren. "An open oath record cannot be overridden by anticipated conflict." Talren followed the first half. His attention sharpened at the final sign. Again, Ysabet repeated it more slowly. "Open oath. No override. Anticipated conflict." Sareth watched her hands with the patience of a man waiting for an inconvenience to finish. "Her interpretation is irrelevant," he said. The appointed witness had already been removed for corruption. Talren looked at him. "Removed on Farron's filing. Confirmed by your decree." The words struck the chamber cleanly. Sereth did not need to defend the exile. He only needed to remind the king who had made it law. Talren's hand tightened around the edge of the war ledger. You advised me to sign it. I advised you that a compromised witness threatened the crown, and I signed. Yes. Yes. Sereth's gaze did not soften. The War Council acted upon the king's decision. If that decision was flawed, the machinery beneath it did not become unlawful by obeying. Ysabet lifted both hands. A decree filed before a treaty closes is not caution, it is construction. Talren caught only decree, treaty, and construction. This time he did not ask her to shorten the thought. He stepped down from the dais and stood where he could see her hands without turning his weakened ear toward the council. What did she say? The embassy magistrate hesitated before interpreting. A decree filed before a treaty closes is not caution. It is construction. Sereth's burned cheek remained still. Construction is precisely my office. Talren looked toward the archive wall. Open the Chancellor's preparation ledger. Sereth answered before the clerk moved. Military preparation records are sealed above embassy authority. They are not sealed above mine. Breaking them publicly will expose border routes, fuel reserves, and dragon strength. You used those records to prepare a war I had not chosen. I prepared the kingdom for the possibility that you would need to choose it. Talren extended one hand. The ledger. A pair of war clerks brought forward a long iron case. 3 dragonbone locks held it closed. Talren burned through each seal with a narrow line of crown fire. Inside lay sheets of black vellum reinforced with copper thread. The first page listed troop routes toward Ashwater. The second assigned dragonfire fuel from the Cinder Reach. The third granted road contracts to houses that had not yet received a declaration of war. Ysabet moved closer. The preparation dates began 2 days before Farron's false warning, before the claim of Eastern betrayal, before her exile, before the final treaty session. Cause had not merely entered before evidence. The roads had entered before cause. Talren looked at Sereth. You drafted troop movement before Farron warned the council. We had intelligence that negotiations might fail. From whom? Border observers. Named. Protected. Ysabet saw Farron's lower lip tighten at the edge of the chamber. The same protected witnesses. The same words used whenever a record needed authority without scrutiny. She pointed to the fuel allotment. 6 dragon cohorts had received enough Ember reserve for a crossing campaign, not defensive readiness. Siege harnesses had been assigned to the western flight towers. Field healers had been redirected away from the capital before any public threat existed. Sereth said, You see preparation because you are reading it after danger became visible. Ysabet signed toward him. Danger did not become visible. It was written into the root. He did not respond to her hands. Talren did. Not fully, but enough. The roads were prepared for invasion. For response, the direction is east, because Ashwater lies east. The siege harnesses do not defend our shore. Sereth's voice remained calm. If the Eastern King broke the treaty, hesitation would have cost us the crossings. A Dragon King may wait for certainty. A War Chancellor cannot. Talren turned another page. Penalty clauses appeared beneath the road contracts. If mobilization was withdrawn after activation, the Crown owed triple payment to the border houses supplying dragons, fuel, and transport. If Ashwater remained neutral, Dace Ember Shipping retained emergency toll rights for 1 year. If Talren canceled war now, the same houses that had prepared to profit from invasion could claim the Crown had broken lawful contracts. Sereth said, You may stop the declaration. You cannot pretend the cost disappears. You built the cost before I decided. I built consequences strong enough to keep the border houses committed. To war. To the Crown. Ysabet read the final authorization chain. Farron changed the words. Sereth made those words useful. Talren's seal had not begun the conspiracy. It had been waiting at the end of it. A clerk entered through the eastern doors, ash covering his traveling cloak. He looked toward Sereth before approaching the throne. Talren saw it. What happened? The clerk knelt. The first mobilization order was released at dawn. The chamber stilled. Talren's declaration had never been completed. Released by whose authority? He asked. Sereth answered before the clerk could. War, readiness law, permits movement once witness absence, and treaty failure are provisionally entered. Ysabet looked at the hour seal. Dom. The same hour her exile had been filed. The mobilization order had left the capital before Talren entered the embassy to declare war. "Where is the first cohort?" Talren asked. The clerk lowered his head. "Across Ashwater." The truth had reached the throne. The army had already crossed without it. The army had crossed without truth, so truth would have to cross after it. Talren left the throne dais and went directly to the eastern signal gallery. Ysabet followed beneath the war banners while clerks, envoys, and dragon lords moved around them in sudden disorder. Sareth remained behind. He did not need to block the king's path. The machinery he had built was already moving. At the gallery doors, Talren ordered an immediate recall of the first cohort. The signal master did not touch the fire levers. "Majesty, the mobilization oath has entered Frontier Command. Then send a sovereign reversal." A spoken reversal cannot cancel an activated war route once the army crosses Ashwater. It requires matched authority from the original protocol. Talren looked back towards Sareth. The Chancellor descended through the chamber with measured calm. "War. Readiness law prevents a false recall from scattering troops inside hostile territory." "Hostile, according to whose words?" Talren asked. "According to the decree your court accepted. The decree I did not finish. The army does not march according to unfinished intention. It marches according to filed authority." Ysabet stepped between the signal pedestal and the war clerks. The eastern gallery had been designed for spoken flame commands. Bronze speaking horns faced the border. Every order entered through a voice channel, then traveled inside dragonfire to the military towers beyond Ashwater. The same system that had trusted Farron. She signed toward Talren. "Do not send another voice through the road they control." He understood voice and road. "What do you propose?" Ysabet pointed to the paired treaty braziers at the far end of the gallery. They had not been lit since her exile. Unlike military horns, the braziers preserved hand formation, breath timing, and oath fire sequence together. Both kingdoms had built matching stations so treaty witnesses could confirm meaning without depending upon a single interpreter. Farron moved toward them. "Those braziers cannot carry a sovereign military recall." Ysabet turned. "They can carry a treaty suspension." "She has no authority to activate them," he told Talren. "Her exile remains lawful until overturned." Ysabet raised both hands. "You used my legal absence to open war. You cannot use the same absence to close peace." Talren followed the sequence slowly. Sareth watched him struggle. "The witness is exploiting uncertainty," the Chancellor said. "By the time you complete a ceremonial exchange, the cohort will have secured the eastern bank." Ysabet looked at Talren's face. His left side remained turned away from the signal master's voice. The gallery flames roared against the bronze ceiling, and each time someone spoke from that side, Talren's eyes moved a fraction too late. She had protected his secret during the negotiations. Not because he asked, because she understood what it meant to have a limitation treated as proof of unfitness. He had returned that mercy by trusting men who spoke more loudly than she could. Ysabet signed directly to him. "You cannot keep building truth around what you pretend to hear." Talren's expression changed. Farron did not understand the sentence. Sareth understood enough from the king's face. "This is not the hour for private accusation." Ysabet did not look away from Talren. It was the hour 6 weeks ago. His jaw tightened. Then he turned to the signal master. "Light the treaty braziers." Farron stepped forward. "Majesty, if you allow an exiled scribe to speak for the crown, she will not speak for the crown." Talren faced Ysabet. "She will speak as the witness whose absence was used to bypass the treaty." It was not restoration. It was not apology, but it removed his voice from the place where hers was required. The treaty braziers opened with blue-white fire. Ysabet stood between them and formed the first emergency clause. Active oath disputed. Independent testimony incomplete. All armed passage suspended until both crowns confirm meaning. The flame copied the shape of her hands. It preserved the pause between clauses, the position of her mouth, and the breath she released before sealing the sequence. Talren lifted one hand toward the crown fire channel. Ysabet stopped him. He looked at her. She signed, "Heat only, no words." For one moment, the Dragon King stood motionless before his own court. Then he placed his palm against the crown plate without speaking. Gold dragonfire entered beneath Ysabet's signed sequence. Authority followed witness instead of replacing it. The signal crossed Ashwater. The eastern brazier remained dark. One breath passed. Then another. Sereth said. The Eastern Court has no reason to answer. Ysabet watched the far basin. A thin white flame appeared inside it. Not a voice. Hands. The Eastern interpreter's hands formed slowly through the fire. Treaty suspension recognized. No Eastern order authorized armed passage. The court shifted behind them. Farron said, "A border interpreter cannot bind a king." The answering hands continued. Our appointed interpreter was removed before final oath. Our king was told Ysabet Cenn had withdrawn from the session. Ysabet went still. The Eastern king had not merely been mistranslated. He had been isolated from the one witness capable of proving the change. Talren read only fragments. Removed? Ysabet repeated the Eastern signs for him. Their interpreter was taken away. He was told I left. Farron's mouth tightened. Talren saw it. Who carried that message? The Eastern hands changed. Royal Envoy Firan Dace. Farron did not deny the transmission. Cross. Court separation is standard when interpreters compromise neutrality. Ysabet signed sharply. 2 interpreters removed. 1 voice left. Talren understood. Farron had not needed to alter every person in the room. He had only needed to leave both kings dependent upon him. The Eastern brazier flared violently. The interpreter's hands returned, faster now. First cohort sighted at the Ashwater bank. Western dragons descending. No Eastern attack ordered. Then the signal broke. A final fragment remained in the fire. The Eastern interpreter's hands forming one unfinished warning. Too late. The first dragonfire strike had already fallen. The first strike did what Sereth had designed it to do. It made every later attempt at peace look like surrender. Smoke filled the Eastern treaty basin. Through the broken flame, the interpreter's hands appeared again, one sleeve burned away and blood darkening the side of his face. Civilian ferry tower struck. Western dragonfire. No Eastern attack before impact. Farron turned toward the court. The first cohort entered hostile air. A defensive release may have been necessary. Ysabet watched his mouth shape. May have been as if uncertainty could soften fire. Sereth stepped beside the signal gallery. Whatever began the exchange, the Eastern Crown will answer. Full mobilization is now the only protection against retaliation. Talren looked into the damaged basin. You prepared the strike before the cohort crossed. I prepared response authority. You prepared every outcome except peace. Sereth did not deny it. A kingdom that waits for moral clarity during battle becomes a kingdom remembered by its enemies. Ysabet moved closer to the basin. The remaining dragonfire did not replay the attack. It preserved only the formation that had entered the signal, source heat, aiming breath, and command closure. Meaning still required a witness. She studied the white fracture running through the flame. The source heat belonged to a Western war dragon. The aiming breath came from a trained rider. But the final closure had entered before the dragon descended. The strike had not been released in panic. It had been activated by a standing command. Ysabet signed toward Talren. The attack was sealed before contact. He understood attack and before. His eyes narrowed. Show me. She pointed to the 3 fire layers. The first pulsed unevenly with the dragon's living heat. The second narrowed toward the ferry tower. The third formed a hard bronze ring around both. Talren recognized it. Chancellor closure. Sereth answered calmly. Every mobilized cohort carries emergency closure. It prevents hesitation when communication fails. It prevents judgment. Ysabet signed. Talren read enough to turn toward the eastern doors. Ready, my dragon. Farron stepped forward. Majesty, the border is already unstable. Leaving the capital places the crown inside an active war zone. Then the crown should see what its officers entered before it. He looked at Ysabet. You are coming. Farron's lips curved slightly. An exile cannot represent Arcos in foreign negotiation. Ysabet raised both hands. I will not represent Arcos. Talren watched the signs. What will you represent? The unfinished treaty. The answer took him longer to understand. When he did, he nodded once. She travels as an independent witness. Not restored scribe. Not royal servant. Not forgiven woman returned to the place that had expelled her. Independent. Ysabet accepted the distinction because Ashwater was burning. They left the Cinder Embassy beneath a sky stained red by distant dragonfire. Talren mounted his bronze-black dragon. Ysabet rode an ember-gray embassy dragon, trained to follow visible hand commands during treaty flights. She refused the protected saddle behind the king before anyone offered it. At altitude, wind tore spoken orders apart. Talren flew close enough to see her hands. He pointed toward the east, then attempted the sign for halt. His fingers formed it incorrectly. Ysabet corrected the angle without touching him. Again, he repeated it. Better. The effort did not repair what he had done, but it forced him to enter a language he could not dominate merely by speaking louder. Ashwater appeared below them as a black river lit by fire. The neutral ferry tower leaned toward the eastern bank, its upper platform burning. Civilian boats drifted loose beneath it. Western dragons held formation over the river while eastern riders gathered beyond the treaty line. No army had yet charged. The next command would decide whether the strike became a battle. Talren descended before the western cohort. Hold position. The lead commander looked upward but did not move. Wind and dragon roars swallowed half the order. Talren repeated it. The commander's gaze went toward the bronze command ring burning around his saddle. Standing authority outranked an uncertain voice carried through storm. Ysabet flew between the two formations. She raised both hands above her head and formed the treaty signal for suspended passage. Large movements. Clear direction. No interpreter required. Talren placed one palm against his dragon's crown plate. Gold fire rose beneath her signs. Witness first. Authority beneath it. The western formation slowed. Across Ashwater, the eastern riders held their attack. For one fragile moment, the river contained no new fire. The western commander removed a sealed order from his armor. Majesty, frontier law requires completion of the crossing. Talren landed on the scorched western platform. Who issued that law? The commander handed him the order. Sareth's war seal closed the upper edge. Farron's envoy mark sat beneath it. The order had been completed before dawn. If signed treaty suspension is received after mobilization begins, classify suspension as compromised foreign interference. Secure Ashwater crossings. Disable opposing witness channels. Continue until permanent crown command arrives. Ysabet read the final clause twice. Disable opposing witness channels. She looked across the river. The Eastern Treaty brazier stood inside a narrow white tower behind the injured interpreter. It was the only remaining station capable of transmitting signed testimony between the crowns. The western siege dragons began turning toward it. Talren lifted one hand. Halt. The commander remained still. Standing closure cannot be revoked by spoken order after hostile interference, he said. Sareth had designed the command to survive Talren's doubt. Farron had designed it to treat signed truth as foreign corruption. Ysabet mounted her dragon again. Talren caught the edge of her saddle. Where are you going? She pulled her hand free before answering. To keep the witness alive. Across Ashwater, the first siege dragon opened its jaws. They had not crossed the river only to seize land. They had crossed to destroy the language that could stop them. Ysabet crossed Ashwater before the siege dragon released its second breath. The white treaty tower rose from the eastern bank beneath her, narrow and exposed, its upper windows already broken by the first strike. The injured interpreter stood inside the open brazier chamber, one hand pressed to his burned side while the other formed a warning through the smoke. Too low. Ysabet looked up. The siege dragon was not aiming at the tower's roof. It was aiming at the foundation ring where signed fire entered the river channel. Destroy that ring, and no witness signal could cross between the kingdoms again. She pulled hard on the embassy dragon's left rein and raised one arm toward Talren, cut beneath the flame. The sign was older than both crowns, used by treaty riders when spoken commands vanished inside storm or battle. Talren saw it. His bronze-black dragon folded one wing and dropped across the siege line. The released fire struck its armored shoulder instead of the tower foundation. Gold and red flame exploded above the river. Talren's dragon roared, rolled through the impact, and caught the air before hitting the water. The western commander shouted for renewed attack. Ysabet could not hear the words. She read them from his mouth. Witness tower. Classified hostile. The command had been prepared before anyone inside the tower raised a weapon. Talren recovered above the river and turned toward his own formation. He did not speak this time. He copied Ysabet's sign for halt. His fingers were imperfect. His authority was not. Gold crown fire rose beneath the movement, forcing 3 siege dragons to hold their breath. The lead commander remained in formation. Standing closure requires completion, he called. Talren landed between the western dragons and the tower. Then I revoke the closure. You cannot revoke it by voice. Talren looked toward Ysabet. She understood what he was asking before he formed the sign. How? Ysabet pointed to the command ring around the lead rider's saddle. A standing closure could only be broken by the same three forms that activated it: source authority, operational witness, and living dragonfire. Sereth had supplied authority. Farron had supplied witness. The war dragon had supplied flame. Talren could replace the first. Ysabet could challenge the second. But the dragon had to refuse the third. She flew close to the siege beast. Its eyes burned orange beneath the armored brow. Ember restraints ran from its jaw to the command ring, forcing its fire channel open whenever the closure pulsed. This was not discipline. It was compelled release. Ysabet signed directly to the rider. Remove the jawline. He stared at her without moving. She repeated it. The dragon is not choosing the flame. The rider looked toward Talren. Farron's order had taught him to distrust her hands. Talren stepped beside the dragon's head. Do as she says. The rider released one restraint. The dragon pulled back so violently that the command ring cracked. The standing closure lost its living flame. Its bronze light collapsed. Across the river, Eastern riders lowered their weapons but did not disperse. Ysabet entered the treaty tower. The Eastern interpreter was older than she remembered, with copper skin and white hair braided close to his skull. His right hand trembled from the burn, yet his signs remained precise. You came back. They told us you withdrew. Ysabet shook her head. They exiled me before the oath closed. The interpreter's mouth tightened. They removed me the same hour. He reached beneath the damaged brazier and withdrew a thin ember plate wrapped in scorched cloth. The plate held the Eastern Court's final treaty sequence. Not a full memory. Leap, position, hand placements, breath intervals, oath fire order. The Eastern King had accepted neutral passage. Then a diplomatic notice entered the chamber bearing Talren's crown phrase. Ysabet Cenn has corrupted the treaty and withdrawn from further witness. The Eastern interpreter had challenged it. A second notice followed. Eastern signed testimony no longer required. The carrier mark belonged to Farron Dace. Talren entered the tower as Ysabet finished reading. His armor was blackened at one shoulder. He stood on her right side, where he could see her hands clearly without turning his weakened ear toward the burning gallery. What did they receive? Ysabet showed him the ember plate. Farron told both courts the other witness was gone. The Eastern interpreter added, he left one voice between two kings. Talren looked toward the river. The war had not grown from two crowns refusing peace. It had grown from two crowns prevented from witnessing the same agreement. The interpreter formed another sign. Our king rejected retaliation after the first strike. Talren watched carefully. Where is he? The answer came with a visible breath of fear. He left the eastern capital under white flame. Alone. Ysabet turned toward the open tower window. A pale shape appeared beyond the smoke. One enormous eastern dragon crossed the horizon without armor, banners, or escort. White treaty fire streamed from its wings. The Eastern King was coming to Ashwater without a war formation. Below, the Western command rings recognized royal dragonfire. One by one, the siege dragons turned toward him. Sereth's standing order had classified any Eastern crown flight as hostile. The man who had never wanted war was flying directly into the command prepared to begin it. The Eastern King entered the range of Sereth's standing order before Talren could leave the treaty tower. Bronze command rings flared across the Western formation. Hostile crown flight recognized. Interception authorized. The siege dragons opened their jaws. Ysabet ran to the broken window and raised both hands above her head. White flame. Treaty sovereign. No armed escort. The Western riders saw her signs. They also saw the command rings burning beneath their saddles. One dragon released fire. Talren's bronze-black dragon launched from the river platform and struck the flame broadside. Gold scales vanished inside red heat. The blast threw both dragons toward Ashwater, but Talren held the line between the Western formation and the unarmed Eastern King. "Stand down," he shouted. The river wind tore his voice apart. The command rings continued pulsing. Ysabet descended the tower stairs with the Eastern interpreter beside her. His injured hand shook, so she took the larger signs while he maintained the treaty fire sequence with his left. They stood together on the river platform, 2 witnesses, 1 from each crown. Ysabet signed the emergency sovereign approach clause. A ruler entering under white flame may not be targeted while independent witnesses remain active. The Eastern interpreter repeated the formation. Their movements matched. The treaty brazier answered with 2 columns of white fire. The standing command hesitated. Not broken. Challenged. The lead Western commander looked toward Talren. Sareth's order classifies the Eastern Crown as hostile after first impact. The first impact came from us, Talren said. The Chancellor's record says otherwise. Ysabet watched the commander's mouth. He was not refusing Talren because he wanted war. He was refusing because every lawful channel beneath him had already been written to make peace look like disobedience. Talren turned toward her. What stops the command? Ysabet Cenn. The king must withdraw spoken priority. He followed the first 2 signs, then lost the rest. She repeated them. Withdraw. Spoken. Priority. His face went still. Arcos war law placed spoken royal command above all signed testimony during active conflict. As long as that law remained, Sareth's recorded order could outrank any gesture Talren made afterward. To stop the attack, Talren had to surrender the privilege his court had used against Ysabet. Farron's voice reached them through a fire horn from the western bank. Majesty, do not alter crown protocol under foreign pressure. The Eastern King's arrival may be theater designed to fracture command. Ysabet looked toward the horn. Farron was still trying to place one voice between 2 rulers. Talren removed the black speaking seal from his throat. The Western commanders watched. So did the Eastern riders. He held the seal above Ashwater. My spoken command will no longer override independent signed testimony. Sareth's authority mark flared inside the command rings, resisting the declaration. The lead commander called back. A verbal surrender of verbal priority is not recognized under active war law. Talren looked at Ysabet. For the first time, there was no expectation that she would translate his intention into the form the law required. Only a question. Show me. Ysabet formed the renunciation slowly. I withdraw exclusive spoken authority from all treaty and war commands touching Ashwater. Talren copied here. His first attempt bent the sign for withdraw into release. Ysabet corrected the angle of his fingers without touching his hand. Again. He repeated it. This time, the formation held. He placed the speaking seal inside his palm and breathed crown fire across the sign sequence. The black metal split. Across the western formation, every command ring went dark. The siege dragons closed their jaws. The Eastern King crossed the final distance without armor or escort. His white dragon landed on the scorched river platform opposite Talren. No one bowed. The 2 kings stood with Ashwater between them and witnesses at their sides. The Eastern King spoke first. Ysabet read his lips. I never ordered an attack. Talren turned his right side toward him, exposing the ear that heard better. I know that now. The Eastern King looked toward Ysabet and the injured interpreter. They removed both of you before asking either crown what had been agreed. Ysabet Cenn. They made absence look like consent. The Eastern interpreter repeated it aloud for his king. Talren watched her hands. His own court had treated them as lesser evidence. Now 2 kingdoms depended upon their precision because spoken authority had become contaminated. A white signal rose from the eastern bank. Then a red one answered from the west. Not an attack. A seizure order. Sareth's seal appeared above the western command tower. Talren's renunciation of spoken priority has compromised wartime sovereignty. High War Chancellor assumes emergency command pending crown review. Western soldiers turned toward the treaty platform. Not against the Eastern King, against Talren. Farron's voice followed through the fire horns. Ysabet Cenn has unlawfully influenced the Dragon King during active conflict. Detain the exile. Restore sovereign command. Talren moved in front of her. Ysabet stepped beside him instead. She would not be hidden behind the same authority that had once expelled her. The Eastern King raised one hand, offering sanctuary across the river. Ysabet did not move toward him either. She faced the Western soldiers and signed so widely that every rider could see. I will negotiate the treaty again. Not through Farron. Not through Sareth. Not through either king speaking over the witnesses. Talren understood enough to answer with his hands. Under your terms. He reached toward her as if apology might fit inside the sign. Ysabet withdrew her hand before he could complete it. Not yet. Across Ashwater, Sareth's emergency banners rose above the western towers. Talren had chosen to listen. His court had answered by declaring him unfit to rule. Sareth's soldiers reached the treaty platform before the emergency banners finished rising. They came in 2 lines, shields forward. Bronze command rings dark after Talren's renunciation. With outspoken priority, they could no longer rely on the old war channel to tell them whose order outranked whose. That uncertainty made them more dangerous. The captain at their head looked from Talren to the Eastern King, then toward Ysabet. By emergency command of High War Chancellor Sareth Ilian, Ysabet Cenn is detained for unlawful interference with sovereign authority. Ysabet stepped to the center of the platform. She did not wait for Talren to defend her. She signed broadly enough for both armies to see. Ask him to show the law I broke. The captain did not understand. The Eastern interpreter spoke the meaning aloud. A pause moved through the soldiers. Talren looked toward the Western command tower where Sareth's banner burned above the roof. Bring the order here. The captain's mouth tightened. The Chancellor's authority is sufficient. Then it can survive being read. The order arrived through the fire channel as a bronze strip covered in Ember script. Ysabet read it before Talren did. Emergency detention authorized for any witness whose testimony alters Crown command during active conflict. She pointed to the phrase, any witness, then to the treaty braziers, then to the injured Eastern interpreter standing beside her. The order did not accuse only Ysabet. It made every independent witness a threat whenever testimony changed military direction. Sareth had not defended sovereignty. He had written a law that allowed war to silence correction. Talren read the clause and looked toward the soldiers. If you enforce this, you must detain both treaty witnesses. The captain glanced toward the Eastern King. That would turn detention into an assault on a foreign court. Farron's voice entered through the Western horn. The Eastern interpreter stands beyond Arcos jurisdiction. Ysabet does not. Ysabet watched the shape of his mouth inside the fire. Beyond jurisdiction. He was trying to divide the witnesses again. She turned toward the Eastern King and signed, "Will you negotiate under equal testimony?" The Eastern interpreter voiced the question. The king answered without hesitation. "Yes." Ysabet faced Talren. "Will you?" Talren copied the sign for yes instead of speaking it. The movement was imperfect. The commitment was not. Ysabet stepped between the paired braziers. She did not ask either king to sit above the other. She placed them on opposite sides of the same black stone table, with both interpreters standing in full view. Farron's horn continued protesting. "This negotiation is invalid. The Western Crown cannot enter treaty revision while its king is under witness influence." Talren turned off the horn. The silence felt cleaner than victory. Ysabet began with the clause that had been removed. No act of war may proceed without independent signed testimony from both kingdoms. The Eastern interpreter repeated it. Both kings marked acceptance through breath and dragonfire. Next came neutral passage through Ashwater. Civilian boats. Healers. Unarmed caravans. No armed dragonfire within the treaty corridor. Each clause entered the paired braziers in matched formation. Hence, mouths, breath, oathfire. No single voice could alter the shape without leaving a visible break. On the western bank, soldiers began lowering their weapons. Not because they trusted Ysabet completely, because for the first time the treaty offered a record no one person controlled. Sareth appeared on the command tower balcony. His armor caught the red emergency light. "You are surrendering the crossings," he called. Talren turned toward him. "We are returning them to neutral control. You cannot pay the penalties already triggered. The contracts were drafted before lawful conflict. They were signed by Crown officers, not by the Crown." Sareth looked toward the border houses gathered beneath his banner. "If these contracts fall, your fuel allotments, road grants, and military protections fall with them." The houses shifted. Their loyalty had never belonged entirely to Sareth. It belonged to the benefits he had promised. Ysabet opened the preparation ledger on the treaty table and turned it toward them. She pointed to the dates. Troop routes before warning. Fuel allotments before treaty failure. Penalty clauses before war. The Eastern interpreter spoke her signs aloud. The war was budgeted before it was justified. Farron emerged from the western gallery, no longer hidden behind a horn. "You cannot reduce national security to filing sequence." Ysabet looked directly at him. "Sequence is what turns preparation into conspiracy." He dismissed the signs with a glance. Then one of his own shipping representatives stepped forward from the border delegation. December shipping was promised doubled tolls after one lunar quarter. Farron's face hardened. The representative continued. We were told the Eastern Crown had already refused peace. Another House Lord spoke. We were told the war declaration had been signed. Sereth's coalition began breaking not from remorse, but from realizing they had been bound to contracts built on false timing. Farron moved toward the treaty table. Talren blocked him. Ysabet raised one hand. Do not speak for me. Talren stopped. She faced Farron herself. You changed the treaty because you believed my hands would disappear with me. Farron finally answered her signs aloud through the Eastern interpreter. You were one scribe. Ysabet formed the next sentence slowly. One witness is enough to make a lie expensive. The paired braziers flared. The western border houses withdrew their seals from Sereth's emergency command. One by one, his banners went dark. Farron turned toward the western exit. His own allies closed it before Talren gave any order. The Eastern King stood. My court rejects all terms delivered solely through royal envoy Farron Dace. Talren added his crown fire beneath the statement. So does mine. The new treaty sealed with 2 kings, 2 interpreters, and equal signed testimony. Across Ashwater, the first cohort extinguished its war flames. Sereth remained on the tower, stripped of every command that required obedience from men no longer willing to profit beside him. He had built a war machine that could move before truth. Ysabet had made truth visible enough that the machine could no longer pretend it was neutral. Talren looked toward her hands. This time, he did not attempt apology. He signed only one question. What comes next? What came next was not forgiveness. It was procedure rebuilt in public. Ysabet stood between the paired treaty braziers while the last war flames died above Ashwater. Western soldiers withdrew from the eastern bank. Civilian ferries returned beneath white passage banners, carrying healers instead of weapons. Talren remained across the table from the Eastern King. He had asked what came next. Ysabet answered with both hands. The treaty must be witnessed again from the beginning. Not corrected, not amended around Farron's changes. Rebuilt. The Eastern interpreter voiced her signs for those who still understood only speech. No single envoy may carry the meaning of 2 crowns. Ysabet formed the next clause. Signed testimony shall hold equal authority with spoken testimony. The Eastern King placed his hand above the white brazier. Talren did the same above the gold. Neither released fire until both interpreters confirmed the formation. The clause entered the treaty in 4 visible layers. Hands, lips, breath, oath fire. No layer outranked another. The Ember Conch had not judged who deserved peace. It had restored the missing shape of the oath. Ysabet now made certain no future court could erase that shape by removing the person who signed it. She continued, every royal negotiation requires 2 independent witnesses from each kingdom. No witness may be exiled, dismissed, detained, or declared legally absent while an oath record remains open. Any command issued after a witness is removed must be suspended until the removal is reviewed by both courts. The Western nobles shifted at that clause. Several had survived by treating inconvenient testimony as misconduct. Ysabet did not soften it for them. Farron stood beneath guard near the extinguished warhorn. His own shipping allies had withdrawn their seals, but he still carried himself like an envoy waiting for a less emotional room. This structure will paralyze emergency diplomacy, he said. Kings cannot wait for every hand to agree while armies move. Ysabet turned toward him. Armies moved because you arranged for the hands to be absent. The Eastern interpreter spoke the sentence aloud. Farron did not answer. Sereth was brought down from the command tower after the border houses refused his emergency authority. He offered no confession. He argued that readiness had preserved the Western Bank and that kingdoms survived because commanders prepared for the worst before rulers accepted it. Talren fasst him. You prepared the worst until peace could no longer compete with it. I prepared what your throne was too slow to see. My throne was not slow. It was made last. Sereth's gaze moved toward Ysabet. A witness should not govern war. No, Talren said. But war should not be built to survive witness. Farron and Sereth were returned to the capital for separate trials. Treaty falsification, unlawful removal of appointed witnesses, fraudulent war authorization, concealed profit contracts, and military action issued before sovereign declaration. Ysabet did not ask for their executions. She asked for every filing chain to be opened, every transport contract, every interpreter dismissal, Every emergency absence. A punishment could remove 2 men. A record could reveal how many doors had already learned their methods. When the court returned to the Cinder Embassy, the crimson war banners were taken down. The Ember Conch remained on its pedestal, but it no longer stood alone as the official memory of negotiation. Beside it, Ysabet established a signed archive. Treaty signs were carved into heat-treated glass, preserving hand position, timing, and sequence. Spoken clauses were recorded separately. Neither version became official until both matched. The first law entered into the new archive declared, "Understanding does not belong to sound." The public hearing began 3 days later. Talren stood before the same court that had watched Ysabet brought in wearing exile cuffs. She stood without chains, not beside his throne. At the treaty table, he did not restore her former position. She refused it before he could offer. "I will not return as the scribe whose authority disappears when an envoy dislikes her hands," she signed. The court interpreter began translating. Talren raised one hand. "Let her finish." Ysabet continued. "The Cinder Embassy will recognize an independent house of witness. Its scribes answer to the treaty record, not the throne, the war council, or the envoy office." Talren accepted every condition. Then he removed the gold hearing guard hidden beneath his left ear. The court went still. Dragonfire had damaged that side years earlier. Since then he had concealed how often ceremony became fragments, how often he depended upon the nearest confident voice to complete what he missed. "I treated hearing as proof of authority," he said. "While hiding that, I did not hear equally myself." Ysabet watched his mouth. He did not use the wound to excuse her exile. "I trusted the record that required the least admission from me. Then I punished the witness who saw what I refused to name." The statement entered both spoken and signed archive. Talren marked it with his own hand. Months passed before he came to the House of Witness without armor or attendants. Ysabet was teaching young embassy scribes how to read dragonfire breath between signs when he waited at the door. He did not enter until she looked at him. Talren raised his hands. His first sign was careful. "May I speak with you?" Ysabet nodded. He began an apology. The sign for regret was correct. The sign for harm was not. His hand moved toward hers so she could guide the fingers. Ysabet withdrew before he touched her. Talren stopped. "Too soon," she said aloud, though she could not hear the shape of her own voice. He read her lips. Then he signed again. Not forgiveness. Learning. Ysabet studied his hands. They were no longer the hands that had signed exile without reading what her absence would permit. They were not yet trustworthy either. She corrected his final sign without touching him. Talren repeated it until the meaning held. Outside, the rebuilt treaty braziers carried equal witness between 2 kingdoms. Inside, the Dragon King remained standing before the woman he had once removed from the room. This time, he waited until she chose to answer.